When most people think about Japan's military during World War II, they imagine Zero fighters, kamikaze missions, and island battles across the Pacific. But one part of Japan's wartime navy is often overlooked. Even though it played a huge role in Japan's strategy and absorbed enormous resources, its submarine fleet. Japan entered the war with bold ideas about submarine warfare. These submarines were not just tools for sinking enemy ships. They carried aircraft. They launched midget subs for harbor raids. They delivered supplies to cut off garrisons. They carried elite teams to remote islands. And they served as Japan's long-range eyes and ears across the Pacific. When the war ended in 1945, hundreds of Japanese submarines still existed. From massive aircraft, carrying monsters to small, cramped coastal boats, what happened to all of them is a remarkable story of destruction, secrecy, scientific research, Cold War strategy, and the erasure of an entire fleet over just a few years. To understand what happened, we begin with the moment Japan surrendered. On the 15th of August 1945, when Emperor Hirohito announced the surrender, Japan's submarine force was scattered across the Pacific. Some were still at sea, others were hidden in coastal inlets. Many were docked at bases in Japan, refitting or awaiting missions that would never happen. Japan had built more than 160 submarines during the war. These included several long-range fleet submarines capable of crossing the entire Pacific, submarines designed to launch small reconnaissance aircraft. The massive I-400 class aircraft carriers, Southern submarines meant to slip past blockades. Southern midget subs used for attacks at Pearl Harbor, Sydney, and other harbors. Swing Kiten, human torpedo, submarines. For new crews by late 1945, fewer than half remained. Many had been sunk in the final years of the war as Allied anti-submarine warfare improved dramatically. Radar, sonar, depth charges, and air patrols tore huge holes in Japan's undersea fleet. The surviving submarines were still impressive. Some were enormous. Others were technologically refined. All were valuable to the Americans, who wanted to know exactly how Japan had designed and used them. When the surrender order reached the submarine bases, crews were stunned. Many had been prepared for suicide missions. Others were training for last-ditch operations. Now they were told to surface, raise black flags, and await American instructions. For many submariners, surrender was a hard moment. They had spent years underwater, in cramped metal tubes, operating in silence and danger. Now their boats became symbols of defeat. As soon as the war ended, American naval intelligence moved quickly. They sent teams to secure every Japanese submarine they could find. Some submarines were ordered to sail to designated surrender points with their crew still aboard. Others were boarded at their home ports by American officers. The Americans had multiple goals. They wanted to inspect Japanese submarine design. They wanted to examine propulsion systems and torpedoes. They wanted to prevent the Soviets from getting access to advanced technology. They wanted to assess whether any submarines could be reused or studied. American officers were impressed by what they found. Japanese submarines were not perfect, but several models were innovative. The I-400 class stood out immediately. These were the largest submarines in the world at the time. They carried 3 folding-wing attack aircraft in a watertight hangar. Their mission had been to strike the Panama Canal. Other submarines contained specialized equipment, such as long-range radios, snorkels, or transport compartments for elite troops. American intelligence teams documented everything. They photographed machinery, measured hull curves, examined torpedo tubes, and interviewed crew members who suddenly found themselves explaining their equipment to former enemies. But the Americans did not just inspect these submarines. They took control of them. One of the most important chapters in the story of Japan's submarines was the systematic destruction of the fleet. The Americans had no interest in letting Japan keep submarines. Post-war policy was clear. Japan would have no military. Every submarine had to be eliminated. But there was another motive. The United States did not want the Soviet Union. now an uneasy wartime ally drifting toward Cold War rivalry. To get its hands on Japanese submarine technology, the Soviets demanded access. They insisted that Japan's weapons should be divided among the Allies. On paper, the request was legitimate. In practice, the United States had other plans. They destroyed the submarines before the Soviets could see them. 2 operations were organized for this purpose. This took place near Sasebo and included more than 20 submarines. The Americans lined them up, towed them offshore, and sank them in deep water. Some were sunk by explosive charges, others by naval gunfire or torpedoes. A similar operation near Nagasaki targeted additional submarines. These submarines were towed into the open sea and scuttled. American sailors described the sight of huge submarines slipping beneath the waves. Some sank evenly, like disappearing buildings. Others went down violently, breaking in half or rolling over before plunging into the dark water. It was an efficient erasure. By 1946, most of Japan's submarine fleet lay at the bottom of the sea. Not every submarine was destroyed immediately. The most technologically interesting subs were taken by the US Navy for study. This included the I-400 class, the giants of the fleet. The I-400 and her sisters were astonishing vessels. They were more than 400 feet long. They carried aircraft in a sealed cylindrical hangar. They had long range. They had advanced periscope systems. Their mission against the Panama Canal was bold, risky, and technically complex. The Americans were so intrigued that they sailed 2 I-400 submarines and 1 I-14 across the Pacific to Pearl Harbor. There, engineers and submarine experts examined them closely. They studied the aircraft catapult, the hangar doors, the fuel systems, and the flight launch procedure. They measured hull strength, diving depth, and internal layout. American submarine designers learned from the I-400's engineering, especially its storage systems and long-range capabilities. Some of these insights eventually influenced Cold War submarine concepts. But once the research was complete, there was one problem. The Soviets demanded access. If the I-400S remained above water, the United States would be forced to share its findings. So the Americans destroyed them. In 1946, the US Navy towed the I-400, I-401, and I-14 to deep water off Hawaii. Then they fired torpedoes into them and sent them to the ocean floor. Their remains rested undiscovered for decades until underwater exploration teams located them in the early 2000s. Beyond the large fleet submarines, Japan had built hundreds of midget submarines and human torpedo craft, known as kaitin. These small submarines played dramatic, sometimes tragic roles in the war. These were used in harbor attacks such as Pearl Harbor, Sydney, Diego Suarez. Many were destroyed during the war. The surviving ones were found in various states of decay. Some were rusted to the point of collapse. Others still contained torpedoes and explosives. After the war, the Americans ordered all midget subs to be scrapped or dumped. A few were kept for study, including ones displayed today in museums in Australia, the United States, and Japan. Kaitin submarines were essentially piloted suicide torpedoes. Their pilots trained to crash themselves into enemy ships. The occupation forces saw them as dangerous relics. Americans removed detonators, disarmed warheads, and destroyed the majority of Kaitin hulls. Only a few survive today as museum pieces. The story of the submarine fleet cannot be told without understanding what happened to the men who served aboard these vessels. Submariners were considered elite during the war. Their training was tough. Their missions were dangerous. Their survival rates were low. When the war ended, these men faced a mix of emotions. They returned to a Japan that had no place for their skills. There were no submarines, no navy, no military jobs. Many submariners became fishermen, factory workers, shopkeepers, or farmers. Others struggled with trauma. Partly because submarine warfare was intensely stressful, and partly because Japan's defeat shattered their sense of identity. Unlike pilots, who sometimes found work in emerging industries or aviation-related fields, submariners had few direct civilian equivalents for their expertise. Many lived quietly for the rest of their lives. A small number contributed to the future of Japan's new maritime forces, but that came later. Even after most Japanese submarines were sunk or scrapped, the Americans kept the technical data, blueprints, and engineering notes they captured. Some of this information influenced post-war submarine design, especially in the areas of Tavitevian, long-range underwater navigation, hovercraft storage concepts, scientific quiet, engine mounting fighty internal layout for extended patrols. The US Navy, already on the path toward nuclear submarines, used Japanese designs as comparison material. The Soviets also captured a handful of Japanese submarines in northern Korea and parts of Manchuria. These were small and not as advanced as the I-400 series, but the Soviets still examined them for anything useful. The race to claim Japanese technology reflected the larger shift taking place globally. World War II had ended, but the Cold War had begun. By the early 1950s, global politics changed again. The Korean War forced the United States to reconsider its strict demilitarization policy in Japan. Suddenly, America needed a stable, capable ally in East Asia. This shift led to the creation of the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force. In 1954, the new maritime force was not a navy in the old sense. It was defensive, not aggressive. It was designed to patrol waters, not threaten foreign nations. Japan eventually developed a small but advanced submarine force. It had nothing to do with the submarines of World War II. The designs were new. The philosophy had changed entirely. Post-war submariners were trained under new standards and new international expectations. A handful of former submariners from the wartime Navy helped guide the early stages of training and organization. But the new fleet had no connection to the old one. The entire wartime submarine program was gone, buried or sunk. Decades later, underwater exploration teams began locating the submarines destroyed after the war. In deep waters off Hawaii, researchers found CVD, the enormous I-420, the I-401 Funden, the I-14. Their I-14, their hangar doors were visible. Their deck guns were still present. They lay in silence, preserved by the deep ocean, far from the country that had built them. Other submarines were found off the Japanese coast, near Sasebo and Okinawa. These discoveries helped historians map the destruction of the fleet and understand how the American operations unfolded. For many submariners' families, these discoveries brought closure. They finally knew where the vessels had gone. Japan's wartime submarines disappeared quickly after the war, but their impact did not. Their legacy lives on in several ways. Japan's submarine doctrine during the war was fundamentally flawed. Japan focused on attacking warships instead of merchant shipping. This allowed American supplies to flow freely and helped the Allies win the Pacific campaign. Post-war naval thinkers studied this mistake carefully. The I-400 class remains one of the most fascinating submarine designs in history. Its aircraft hangar, catapult, and long-range systems showed remarkable innovation. Even if the submarine itself never launched a wartime mission, it pushed the boundaries of undersea engineering. The destruction of Japan's submarines symbolized the end of a wartime vision that had consumed enormous national resources. These boats represented technological ambition, strategic creativity, and ultimately desperation. The elimination of the submarine fleet helped Japan transition to a peaceful nation. Without offensive submarines, Japan focused on rebuilding its economy, infrastructure, and society, not its navy. Today, Japan builds some of the most advanced conventional submarines in the world. These modern vessels are used strictly for defense, but they reflect the technical skill that Japan regained through peaceful development. They stand in contrast to the wartime fleet, whose purpose was to expand an empire. The story of Japan's submarines after World War II is a story of disappearance. In only a few months, an enormous fleet that had taken years to build was erased. Some were sunk at sea. Others were destroyed on docks. A few were shipped across the Pacific, studied, and then scuttled. But this disappearance was deliberate. The submarines represented a militaristic past that Japan needed to leave behind. Their destruction opened the door to a new identity, based not on conquest but on rebuilding. The submarines may rest at the bottom of the ocean, but their story remains an important reminder of how nations transform. What was once a symbol of power became a symbol of change, and eventually a chapter in a larger narrative of peace, reinvention, and recovery.